Warning: disturbing content. Viewer discretion is advised.
You may have heard about child abuse and neglect. Do you know what they mean? They include acts of commission and omission and are preventable. Child abuse and neglect include acts of commission and omission. What are acts of commission? Acts of commission are deliberate and intentional. However, harm to a child might not be the intended consequence. Some examples include physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse. What are acts of omission? Acts of omission are the failure to provide for a child's basic physical, emotional, or educational needs, or to protect a child from harm or potential harm. Some examples include physical neglect, emotional neglect, medical and dental neglect, educational neglect, inadequate supervision, exposure to violent environments. About 1 in 7 children experience some form of child abuse or neglect in the last year. It's important to be able to recognize the basic types of child abuse and their effects on children and understand the guidelines for reporting suspected child abuse or neglect. Who are the children affected often by child abuse or neglect? Children who are less than 1 year of age have the highest rate of victimization. Overall, girls and boys are equally affected, but more girls are sexually abused and more boys are fatally injured. Having an unrelated caregiver living in the home increases the risk of child abuse or neglect. But it's important to remember that any child of any age, from any family, from any community, may be a victim of child abuse or neglect. The basic types of child maltreatment include physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect. And neglect can take on a variety of forms, including physical needs, medical and dental needs, or educational needs. Physical abuse is any kind of non-accidental injury that results from the act of omission or commission on the part of a parent, guardian, or custodian. So it could be something that the parent did do or something that they didn't do that results in the harm. Injuries are often the result of punching, beating, kicking, biting, shaking, throwing, or otherwise harming a child. But it's important to recognize that it may not have been the intent of the individual to harm the child as severely as they did, but nonetheless, they did inflict the injury, and it is therefore physical abuse. Sexual abuse is any kind of sexual activity that is inappropriate for the child's age, level of development, or role within the family. This conceptual definition helps differentiate what may be normal sexual experimentation among 2 4-year-olds that is clearly distinct and different from sexual activity between a 4-year-old and an adult. These activities can include fondling a child's genitals, penetration, incest, rape, sodomy, indecent exposure, and exploitation. It also includes pornography. And neglect is the failure to provide for a child's basic needs. Those basic needs include necessary food, clothing, shelter, and appropriate supervision, one of the most common causes for neglect. Medical neglect includes not paying attention or providing for necessary medical or mental health treatment. And educational neglect is failure to educate a child or attend to their special education needs. Emotional neglect is inattention to the child's emotional needs. Emotional abuse is a pattern of behavior between the child and parent that damages a child's emotional development or sense of self-worth. This can include activities such as constantly terrorizing and frightening the child intentionally, ignoring the child, isolating them frequently, or corrupting and exploiting the child. Those would be activities such as having the child sell your drugs because the child won't get as much trouble as the parent would. And constant rejection of the child is another form of emotional abuse. There are a number of red flags, or those big markers that should make you think about the possibility of child maltreatment. It's important to recognize that as you see lists of behaviors or injuries that should make you think about the possibility of child abuse, they suggest the possibility, but in isolation, they don't usually prove it. There are behavioral indicators, changes in behavior, physical indicators, bruises or injuries, but it's important to use common sense in deciding and figuring out, does this really make me worry about abuse, or is there some other good explanation for what it is I'm seeing in the child? What are some of the signs of possible physical abuse in the child? When the child has an injury that does not make sense for the child's age or development, such as the 3-week-old who supposedly crawled to the top of the stairs, the infant with bruising anywhere on the body or blood in the eye or the mouth is a huge red flag. Infants rarely get accidental bruises. Any bruising of the trunk, the ears, or the neck in a child who's less than 4 years of age is a big red flag, and patterned bruises or burns, injuries that have marks that outline or identify the object that was used to inflict the injury, are another sign of possible physical abuse. Bruises on uncommonly injured body parts, also a big red flag. We see kids getting bruises on their shins and on their foreheads, but it's rare to see accidental bruises on the abdomen, the chest, the buttocks, or the ears. A child who has multiple serious injuries at different stages of healing, especially if they're in unusual locations or totally unexplained, should again raise some level of concern. Any child who reports that they are being physically harmed or injured should be taken seriously. What about the signs of sexual abuse? Any child who reports sexual touching should be taken seriously. Any unexplained genital pain or bleeding. And unexplained means after a good medical evaluation, there is not a good explanation or medical condition that would account for the child's bleeding. The young child who demonstrates bizarre, sophisticated, or unusual sexual knowledge or behavior is a red flag. We have to think about, where did this child learn these activities? The child who asks unexpected or unusual questions related to sexual activity would fall into this category as well. We have to contemplate and decide, what have they learned, what are they seeing versus what are they experiencing? And any child who becomes pregnant or contracts a sexually transmitted disease at less than 14 years of age is a sign of sexual abuse. What about the parents? When the parent offers a conflicting and unconvincing or no explanation at all for a child's serious injury, that raises the concern. If the parent shows little concern for the child, sees the child as entirely bad or evil, if the parent demands a level of performance that the child cannot attain, often child abuse occurs in the context of a child crying too much or a child who wets their pants. Parents expecting them to not wet their pants, but in fact, that's obviously going to happen. The parent who denies the existence of or blames the child for problems in home or at school, the parent who uses harsh physical discipline, all red flags. And when there's domestic violence, drug or alcohol abuse in the home, or mental illness in the home, the risks are higher to those children for possible maltreatment. All citizens have a legal obligation to report concerns of possible child abuse or neglect, even if someone else disagrees with them. We as citizens cannot investigate or handle the problem alone. It requires a joint effort. And it's not our jobs in general to do that legal investigation. The reporter's identifying information is kept confidential unless it is necessary in court. When should you report? You report to Child Protection Services when you have a reason to believe that child abuse or neglect may have occurred. That reason can be based on what you see, what you hear, or what you have been told. It's a misdemeanor not to report if there is a reasonable suspicion of child abuse or neglect, and there is immunity from civil or criminal liability for a good faith report, a report you made because you were honestly concerned about the child. When you report, you should be providing the concerns and reasons that you are reporting and what it is that you suspect. If you don't provide the detail, the authorities will not know what to investigate. You may report anonymously, but then the authorities cannot get more information from you if it is needed. Once you call the hotline, an official report has been made. The report is reviewed by a CPS supervisor who determines if there is enough concern to begin a formal assessment of the situation. If so, the case is assigned to a caseworker whose job it is to assess the concerns and determine what services or protection, if any, are needed for the child. Remember that lack of reporting contributes to continued victimization by failing to acknowledge that a child may be at risk for further abuse. Your job is to protect the child.
Child abuse casts a shadow, the length of a lifetime.